So one of the first things to realize about extinction is that it is a natural phenomenon. Paleogeologists and people that study all those kinds of things, have given the number of 99%. I think they just shot that out there because they realize the vast majority of things that have lived on Earth no longer live on Earth. The cart is in back through there, and then on your left. So the fossil record for the most part is actually also very incomplete. The majority of life on Earth does not form skeletons and hard shell substances that form fossils, so we're leaving a big part out. But I think it's sufficient to say that, number one, most of the things that live on Earth no longer live on Earth. We've got 5 mass extinctions. And second of all is that it is a natural thing for species to go extinct. So when we're looking at this particular question of how we can reduce the species or reduce the number of species that do go extinct, we have to separate out what we call the background, which is pretty much the same as your natural, so you get the point for that. So this is the rate at which species would normally go extinct. You should not have your phones out. Put them away. Okay. So obviously, to make a difference, it's the same thing with radiation. There's a certain amount of background radiation that always exists in the environment around us. When it's becoming dangerous is when we look at when it goes above that level. So you got to subtract out that background rate, or be able to specifically point to species that you see that we know we're having an impact to the point where they're likely to go extinct. And there's, you can't just say, oh well, they're going to happen that way anyway. So that's what endangered species actually is one that is in danger of going prematurely extinct. So that's like I said before, the extinction of the prematurely extinct is the fact that it wasn't supposed to go already anyway. It's not an easy thing to determine either. You can't really look at a population and say, well, it's about your time, so nice knowing you. See you in the next universe. But it happens. That does happen. I believe some estimates have the average lifespan of a species is 5 million years. This is just based on the fossil record. There are some organisms, though, like the horseshoe crab, that are hundreds of millions of years old and basically the same form or species of it. So there's a lot of variation there. Different types of extinction. The extinction that we most think of as extinction, most people associate with extinction, is when there are no longer any members of that species. Erase is fine. I'm just going to go with a simple gone. That we know of, that we can observe on Earth. So this is also an area where you never really know for sure. The coelacanth, for example. Does anybody know what the coelacanth is? Coelacanth? It's a fish. Coast of Africa. Do you have marine science? I know it's talk about marine science. Anyway, the coelacanth, very interesting fish. I'll show you guys a little video on it later. Is what's called a lobe-finned fish. So not only as a species, their whole class of fish was believed to have gone extinct with the dinosaurs. We see it before the dinosaurs. There's the mass extinction period that happened there. A lot. It wasn't just dinosaurs. A lot of stuff in the ocean also died out, and everybody figured it was extinct. And then in the 1920s, fishermen off the coast of South Africa pulled some in and saw this fish that they had never seen before, and it was a very odd-looking fish. What's odd about it is the fins actually before rather than being fins that just stick out from the side like most bony fish have, the radial type fins. They've got a little protuberance that actually has bones in it that are similar to leg bones that you find in animals and stuff. So it's called a lobe-finned fish, and there was only example of it that is still surviving. There's a lot of them in the fossil record before, like I said, before the dinosaur mass extinction. Anyway, so sometimes we don't know. Sometimes things come back. There's other examples too. Those are called Lazarus species, by the way. So that's what most people think of extinction, but you also have extinctions within an ecosystem that we call local extinctions. The organisms may have died out in that population in that area, or they may have moved out because it's within a particular ecosystem. Genetic extinction is more like a condition of a population. And what it is when there's just so few members of that population left that there's significant inbreeding, and inbreeding does not filter out the bad genes. It tends to magnify the bad genes within a population, so you see a number of defects and things like that. So when they look at these species, these populations, and notice these particular characteristics and look at numbers and things like that, sometimes they will just kind of define or say that that particular species is genetically extinct. For example, the Florida panther. The Florida panther was deemed to be genetically extinct in the late 1980s when its population was in somewhere in the order of the 30s. They were seeing a lot of things like birth defects. Their testicles were not descending in the males, which made them sterile. So there's a number of different things there. And with a population of 30, the problem is, of course, that you can't breed these out. They have to breed within themselves, and therefore these problems become magnified. So you get to the point when the population is so small and these things start to show up that they are believed to be genetically extinct. So fortunately I'd say for us and for big cats in general in Florida, it's a subspecies. Florida panther is a subspecies of the American cougar, which is pretty much what you see with pumas in South America and the mountain lions, etc. You see in the West. And in Texas, they have one that's very similar to the Florida one. Of course, similar environments there. And so they brought in Texas cougars to interbreed, or outbreed is actually what they call it, with the Florida panther. And now the numbers are approaching, I think, 200. But the numbers have come up considerably. However, you no longer have specifically the Florida panther subspecies. I'm pretty sure all the original population that was completely Florida panther has probably died out by now from old age or whatever, or some other reason. However, we now have a large big cat population. Some people are kind of against it. They're like, well, we won't have the Florida panther anymore. That's true. We've got Florida, Texas hybrid panthers, but we've got big cats in Florida again. So I think that was a good thing. Otherwise, it would have died out. So that's what they call genetic extinction. Then you have commercial extinction, also kind of a property of a population. This is going to be for things, primarily fish, of species that we still harvest for profit from the wild, and that's the main thing that we still take out of the wild as a product, and as an animal, you know. The numbers can get to the point, low enough to the point where it's so hard to find them and catch them, etc. It's not profitable to do so. And in the past, you know, just the techniques and everything we had did not allow us to bring most types of marine fisheries to that point, the ocean being so vast and the populations being so large. But as we learned back when we talked about fishery management, that has changed, and certain populations have gotten down, though not really at much danger of a biological or even genetic extinction. They are down to the level that they really can't be harvested in large amounts anymore, and the populations need to recover. So that's part of the whole sustainability things. And if you do things the right way, the populations, you know, you take the older ones and the younger ones will repopulate. So that's called commercial extinction. Any questions about extinction? You know, the natural state of it, different types of extinction. Okay. So there are certain species that are particularly vulnerable to the environmental things, the anthropogenic things that people do to damage them, or just environmental changes in general. Those, of course, have low reproductive rates. That's what you would expect, you know, because they don't have the ability to recover quickly, numbers-wise. Limited geographical ranges. That means that they are fairly isolated to a particular part of the world. Then obviously if you do damage to that population there, you've got no way to recover it, no way to bring other animals in, etc. If they have very specific niches and requirements, whether it's food or shelter, etc. One of the a good example of this one is the panda, because the Chinese giant panda depends upon bamboo shoots. Now bamboo is a pretty prevalent plant worldwide, but specifically in the bamboo forests of China has been harvested tremendously because the Chinese use bamboo for practically everything structural, and therefore that's why this particular species is endangered, why it's suffered from that. People aren't out hunting pandas, for example, and things like that. But it's habitat destruction, as we'll see that's a big thing for a lot of them. But the thing that made that habitat particularly precious for that panda was the fact that its diet that mainly ate those bamboo shoots and things like that. You also see that with big predators and things that need to go long ranges to catch their food. So that's, of course, they're at the top of the food chain. And we know that at the top of the food chain, there's going to be, what, more or less of them than the other things up at the top of the ecological pyramid. For the students, do you have a lot of predators and a little bit of prey, or the other way around?
What?
Less at the top, less predators. That's why they'll have these low reproductive rates. So if you need a good price on reproduction, we have low reproductive rates. The predators, of course, like tigers, for example, breed every 2 to 3 years. So that's difficult when you have an impact on that population. Plus, what was that other phenomenon that happened because of toxins in the environment to top level predators? Where it was worse for them. Remember? Anybody? Biomagnification. Thank you. Very good. So they're also suffering from that. So then another thing with the big predators, they have to range over long distances to get their food. So that can be a problem. And if they have limited genetic diversity for one reason or another, most of the times it's when the population numbers drop that they become less genetically diverse. But sometimes you have genetic drift, you have cutoff of gene flow and things like that just tends to concentrate populations and make them less genetically diverse, more susceptible to diseases and things like that. One of the things we see, and you notice that there were 2 questions on there, I got rid of one of them. But the National Board likes to focus on this, I think probably because it's you can study them so easily because they're isolated, is island populations. They also have been, if we look around the world, some of the worst environmental scenarios have occurred on island populations. And it's kind of obvious, I think, should be. First of all, of course, an island has less resources. Less land means less plants. The plants are the base of the food chain. Therefore, they have less resources in that particular area. Fresh water is oftentimes a limiting resource. To have an actual aquifer on an island, you have to have a certain area and mass of land. If you don't have that, then the species are always going to be relying upon the rainwater. So that can be hard to adapt to. They're more susceptible to tsunamis and earthquakes and hurricanes and other kind of things there because they're small, they're there and things like that. And they don't get a lot of input from the mainland. They don't have the ability to have immigration help them with population problems. So what you saw in that one question on there, it showed islands with several properties. Recall that if you can when you think about this. And it said which one was going to be the most biodiverse, which one's going to have the most diversity of species, be the healthiest, basically, the most stable ecosystem. So your 2 factors, you want to minimize that. So first of all, the bigger island was better. It had more resources and stuff, so it would tend to be more biodiverse. And the closer it was to the mainland, where it can get, through migration and things, species coming in and landing on it, living on it, then you can see that as making it more stable. So if you're thinking about that particular question, you do your pretest again. That's what you're looking for. Closest to land, bless you, and as big an island as possible. All right, finally, there are 2 different ways really to approach this problem of premature extinction. One of them is a species-based approach. Now, this is what has happened in the past, and I'll use the panda again because it's such a great example. And there's something called species vanity, which is simply the fact, psychologically speaking, that people like to support things that are cute. And pandas are definitely cute. Most of your look at the poster over there on the wall with the panda and the tiger. Aren't they all cute and fuzzy? And granted, some of them would definitely eat your face off or whatever. But these look like things. Oh, how could we let that go extinct? But the fact of the matter is there are thousands of endangered species that are plants, or that are funguses, or other things that are not glamorous that you don't want to cuddle with. You wouldn't want to put a poster of it on your wall necessarily, and therefore we will oftentimes tend to neglect those. So with a species-based approach, the good part of it is that it does peak involvement as far as environmental issues. Protecting endangered species is one of the ones that gets the most attention from people because, like I said, let's save the cute rhinos and the whales and things like that. It gets more attention oftentimes. So that's the good side of it. The bad side of it is if you neglect the actual problem, which is the habitat. And that's the biggest problem we see with endangered species. If you have For example, the panda, you do everything you can to protect it. You make laws against it. You put armed guards around it, although people aren't really hunting pandas. But you do what you can to protect it, but you don't protect its environment. Even if it recovers as a species, it doesn't have that habitat in there to recover into. It's kind of pointless. So there's been a shift in ecological thinking and priorities in the past couple of decades away from targeting specific species to try to help, to looking at areas where species tend to be going in general towards extinction and preserving that habitat and trying to reduce the things that are making that happen in those areas. So one of the main things that means is preserving land, and that's what the heck? Perfect? Yes, it's not perfect. So that was actually a good answer.
Heck yeah.
Practical. Well, it wasn't what I call a correct answer, but it was creative enough that, nothing's perfect. So you're gonna do that. Not practical, okay? That means you basically have to say to all these people, you can't use the bamboo in this forest anymore. Even though all of them would probably say, oh, I love the pandas. It's a thing of national pride. They're beautiful, cute, etc. But I need to build my house, or I need this or that or whatever else, or I work at the bamboo processing factory, and I'm going to lose my job if we can't harvest this bamboo. And so that's when it becomes impractical a lot of times for people. So, any questions? What makes the species more vulnerable? What the habitat versus the species approach means? Alrighty. All right, so number one reason, nobody got that in there, habitat alteration, often referred to as habitat destruction. But I guess I figure technically if you take a forest and cut it down and make a farm out of it, you still have a habitat. It's not one that is going to be something that the original species that live there can use necessarily, but it's a different habitat. So habitat alteration is a little bit more concise as far as the terminology, but if you hear the term habitat destruction, it's a more common term. It means the same thing basically. Of course, if you clear cut a forest and then leave it to go back, that's actually better than if you were to clear cut a forest and to grow crops there, as you can imagine. So there is some differences there. But habitat alteration is just basically taking the original habitat the species was in and changing it into something else. One of the things you have to remember is that species in most ecosystems, if they've been through succession, which most have of course, near the final stages, they're going to be maxed out on resources. They're going to be at the carrying capacity, and therefore any kind of loss of that carrying capacity, any kind of loss of food or the shelter, etc., is going to put them over the edge. All right, so therefore, if the biggest problem, the thing that threatens these species the most is habitat destruction, the best way to reduce that is to preserve habitat. And so by forming preserves. And I don't mean making jam. So this can come in a number of different levels. I don't want to go into all the details. There's, for example, in the United States, there's reserves, there's national forests, there's wildlife management areas. There's a whole bunch of them, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to go into that right now. But just basically, where areas where you say the land can only be used for certain things, if any at all. So they do vary. Some of them allow a lot of human activity in them, and some of them you're not allowed even to set foot unless you're a scientist there. They're often established by governments, but you do have private organizations that also do this. A lot of times people with a lot of land, for example, will donate it or they'll establish foundations. The Nature Conservancy, which is, I believe, the biggest environmental, as far as donations every year, is the biggest environmental organization. The main thing they do is they just solicit funds from people, ask for funds, etc., and then they buy up pieces of property, particularly areas that are in at risk and have a high biodiversity and things like that. They look for those and purchase them, and therefore it keeps people from being able to do anything to them. Usually, ironically and sadly, a lot of times the governments can do things even when you have a private property situation. It's something called eminent domain. But for the most part, they do, you know, a good job of keeping it preserved and things like that. So there's different levels, like I said, different levels of access. And you might say, well, it would be best, of course, if nobody was allowed to go into and use these at all. Nature would rule and everything would work out well that way, etc. Which is true from a strictly ecological standpoint. But I always try to influence you on practicality and things like that. If you have national parks, but nobody can go into those national parks, you can't camp or hike there or anything else, all of which activities are going to have impact on that ecosystem, then you're not going to get much support for it. People in plus parks, of course, charge admission, those kind of things. Those go towards keeping and preserving those areas. So you have to, I think, strike a balance between no access and some access, and to keep these things funded and people's interests up. One of the things when it comes to preserving land that you may need to make sure you avoid is something called fragmentation. And just like the name implies, this means you're splitting up an ecosystem. And the reason why this is something that can happen and why it's an issue is that a lot of times this is what people need to do with an ecosystem. You got a big, beautiful state forest, everyone wants to preserve it and everything else like that. However, you've got two cities that have large populations right on opposite sides of each other. Sure would be great if we could just run one little road right down through the forest, and it's not going to take up much space, probably less than 1% of the habitat, and we'll be able to connect through there and still have the beautiful forest around us, and we'll have nice country drives to go on and things. But what they have found is that doing so has a much, much greater impact on the overall ecosystem than simply the amount of space that it takes up. And if there are ways, for example, to do whatever kind of development and stuff you need to in little corners of that ecosystem or whatever else, that would be important to do. So I'm going to go ahead and illustrate this fragmentation concept for you guys. And one of the things is that it is really a matter of geometry. But if you've got, let's say this is a forest, okay? And in that forest, you're going to have area that's on the edge, and you're going to have area that's in the middle, and this would be what we call edge habitat, and this would be core habitat. So these different habitats have different properties to them, okay? Between being deep in a forest is the best example of this, but in certain other environments as well. There are just certain things that properties and habitat and predator-prey relationships, etc., that exist in the core that don't exist in the edge and vice versa. Okay. So what happens when you decide to put a road down through here is simple geometry. Is you have now taken that and split it, and you're going to end up now having much less core habitat and a lot more edge habitat. And a lot of times that core habitat is crucial for the species that live there. And not to say that edge habitat's not good either, but you know, they each have their own properties that the species that exist within them need. And so when you change that, you're going to change that. You're going to change that balance. Some of the things that suffer the most from this, that need a lot of core habitat, are your big predators, your big cats and things like that. Whereas before, they were able to go back and forth through here and you can cover that much area. Now they're going to have to stay within these areas, right? That also produces a problem when it's a road. For what? What do you think is going to likely happen? Yeah, so the number one cause of Florida panther deaths? Road, yeah, getting hit by cars. And there's not that many cars that go through the Everglades. I mean, not that many highways in the Everglades. I think there's two main ones. So that's a big deal when you have the top level predators, etc. Another thing that is a big deal is when they go out looking for love. So the predator animals in general, you know, you've got a population that existed before. You know, you could go over on this side of town if you weren't getting lucky on this side of town, etc. Now what happens, of course, is that your breeding is going to be isolated between these two groups. and therefore become more what? What red in here?
What red's gonna be like in here, because we only can see our cousins every once or twice a year, and we reckon we get ourselves a good time then.
Inbred, okay, so they're more isolated populations, the more inbred they are, whereas before, when they go back and forth there, you know, they would have the more spread. That's called gene flow, by the way. The genes, when the good thing is to have the gene flow where they can go to another area and reproduce with organisms that are more genetically different or dissimilar than what they are. So, any questions about what fragmentation is, how it has the effects that it has on populations, on the genetics, etc. It also affects said something about microclimates. It changes the climate of this area. You'll get air, for example, coming through here that will tend to dry things out even more, reduce that core habitat. So there's other things that happen from fragmentation as well. So the point being is that you get much more impact than that very small amount of land that road, or it could be other things like sometimes people put farms here and there. Wind turbines we mentioned was a big fragmenter of habitat, even though they don't take up that much space. They have that particular problem. So it's going to decrease the core habitat, increase the edge habitat. Populations will be more isolated, reducing gene flow, therefore lowering genetic diversity. Species with a large geographical range, such as your top-level predators, they have to cross those roads. They need to go those long distances in order to get their prey. Their prey becomes harder to catch too, because now you've got this big open space. That was one of the reasons why they like that core habitat, is because they've got, predators need hiding spaces. And therefore you have a lot of them end up getting killed because of that. You can help to reduce that somewhat by building, using, technically that is a correct answer, group 7, but not what we're looking for. But like I said, since it is a type of preservation, we'll give you that. Wilderness corridors. So you might have driven west on Highway 46 out of Sanford towards Mount Dora. You know what I'm talking about? That particular route. What do you see on the sides as you go along? This isn't Donald Trump or anything. Huh? They're fences. Okay. So you get fences along there. Is that to keep the illegal aliens out? No. Anybody watch? All right. Let's not go there. Save it for a politics class, etc. Wow. What is it there to protect?
Wildlife.
Yeah. Anybody know it specifically? Although their population numbers are pretty high now. No, not so much. Deer are, it's good to keep, of course, reduce that. Black bear, that is a prime black bear category in there, Florida black bear. And so they made these, I'll show you a picture of it here in a minute. They made these, there's a little tunnel. So if you drive along there, you'll notice at a point, a little bit outside the river, you get these tall fences that are up on each side of the highway. And then you'll go over a little overpass, just like a bump in the road. You almost don't notice it, but you'll see there the fences stop and go towards that because it's trying to tunnel through. Like I said, I'll show you some pictures here in a minute, or maybe next time. So those help, but of course, in general, just not having that all together, those just help to reduce the roadkill aspect of it. Those don't help to reduce all the other lack of gene flow and stuff. So ideally, you want to preserve as much as usual and as you can. And like I said, if you can lop off a corner rather than going right through the middle of it, that works better for the environment than going through the middle of it. There are areas around the world that have been identified. That's one of the things, if you're going to preserve habitat, you need to be choosy about what you preserve. The Nature Conservancy, of course, does this, as other organizations that have established areas in the world that not only do they normally hold a lot of species of wide biodiversity, therefore most of them are tropical spots, but they are at risk. So that's another thing, as we'll see when you look at the map, a lot of them are islands, for example. So they are under, stress is good, under risk. Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and give you the point for that risk. Should be at risk, I guess. Maybe it did say under stress. Either way, they are being impacted. Exotic species. Who put this, by the way? All right. I'm going to give it to you, although it's not correct. I mean, that is the exotic species are foreign species to an environment, ones that are not normally native to that environment. Non-native species would be another one for that. But they're not technically necessarily what we call invasive species. An invasive species is a foreign or exotic species, so that's what we'll give you the point. But it also is one that is negatively impacting the populations, the native populations. Okay. So there's you know, thousands of species every year that transfer back and forth accidentally, intentionally, etc. But only a few of them, thankfully, only a few of them become problems. But they have definitely been problems for a long period of time. This is to the point where it is the second most common cause of premature extinction. Second most common cause for things to go on the endangered species list. So remember back when I was saying we have a lot of endangered plants. People don't tend to care about them, but it's definitely a problem in a lot of ecosystems. This is a big one for that, is invasive species crowding out through competition. So they will spread out, reproduce fast, quickly, maybe not have the natural predators and other things that affect them, and therefore be able to outcompete the native species, that kind of thing. You don't have that much really predation. You do have some where these are coming in. For example, you may know that the lionfish is becoming popular off the Florida coast and the Indian River areas there. It's poisonous fish from Asia. It apparently is eating a lot of the smaller fish in those areas there. There's not much that will eat it for obvious reasons, like eating porcupine. But so that would be straight predation from that. And disease. Now, disease is a big one with trees because one of the main sources for that is shipping crates. So shipping crates and pallets. Shipping crates and pallets typically are made from very cheap wood because they're going to throw them away once they get to where they're going. We get a tremendous amount of material every day from foreign points, particularly from Asia, and that's just going to keep growing and growing. Of course, that's a big factor in a lot of these things, but in this particular one where you have tree diseases and pests and things like that that come in, is because they use cheap wood for these crates, and of course cheap wood a lot of times is low quality because it is diseased, or it has bugs in it and termites and other kinds of wood-eating bugs and other things, and therefore we get the shipments in, we throw the crates and the pallets and those kind of things in the garbage to go to the landfill, and they're out in the environment then, and these things get out and they get the native tree populations. So that's been a big problem there. Exotic pet trade things of, you know, reptiles and other kinds of things like that, and birds, all kinds of things that people that collect. They want to have something different than your average dog or cat. So one of the things you need to do is to regulate trade of all these potentially problematic species and maybe invasive species, identifying them and making sure that if you've traveled to other countries, you know, going through customs and stuff like that, well, you don't have to go to another country, you see it there. There's always fruit and animals, all these biological things that they're looking for. You know, you think, oh, they want to inspect for drugs or things like that, or weapons or something. Well, of course they do that, but mainly with the customs and stuff is trying to keep out these invasive species and stuff. That's one of their primary functions. And just like I said, with the shipping crates and things like that, inspecting these containers. It's a huge task, these transport containers. If you've ever seen a container ship, there's these huge barge-like vessels. They're enormous, and they're just stacked, you know, not hundreds of feet high, but stacked very high with the transport containers. It's the same things that go on the 18-wheeler trucks and stuff. So if you've ever seen them in the port space, it's a tremendous amount of stuff, a tremendous amount of shipping and international trade, and this has been behind a lot of that. There's a lot of other things, of course, environmental things. Anything that we impact negatively the environment on, it can cause, of course, premature extinction, pollution, climate change. Some will tell you climate change is the main thing. The only reason why we don't say it's the main thing is because it's very hard to pinpoint where it's specifically hurting species, with some exceptions. Over-harvesting, this is primarily, once again, with fish. Fish are the only main thing we still take out of the ocean. Increases in technology we talked about. We talked about fishery management. Increases in technology, population, and demand have pushed a lot of these ocean populations, which, like I said, at one point even biologists thought that they were limitless. You know, there was no way we could make enough of an impact through normal fishing techniques to ever really put a dent on these populations. Now many of them have reached that particular level where they're either restricted or they can't, or they're commercially extinct and those other kinds of things. And anybody get this one? What you might do with an egg? Poaching, thank you. And poaching, which is what? What's poaching?
Killing the egg or the...
Yeah, and then the same thing, don't you? It's when you take endangered species and you put them some water in a pan and simmer them over. Yeah. What is it?
Illegal hunting.
Illegal hunting, right. So I want to make the point there, legal hunting. Legal, regulated hunting is not only typically safe for ecosystems, a lot of times it's necessary. For example, white-tailed deer in Florida, they would be overpopulated for hunting. And not only would they be causing traffic stuff, they would hurt their particular population because we would eliminate a lot of the predators. So with a lot of these species, you know, the biologists, they look at them, they look at the populations, they figure out how much, that's why you have size restrictions and stuff to make sure you get post-reproductive populations and things like that, and seasonal changes and those kind of things. So if you regulate, bless you, and you use science to do so, then it actually can be good for the environment. However, poaching, of course, doesn't do that. They don't follow the rules, and therefore you see some problems with that. And of course, regulating those things that may be the reason why people are hunting them, like trade in ivory, you know, endangered species products. There's tiger and certain types of medicines. People believe that the tiger's gallbladder and stuff can cure things or help things. And tigers, of course, are endangered. Most tigers are. So all those things, so if you can restrict that, eliminate the trade of it, and therefore, if you can, you know, of course, there's always going to be black market stuff going on, but those are ways to do that. Now, there are some techniques that are used a lot of times to try to recover a population. I'll use our old friend, the panda again, because it's such a good example, and also leads us to one of the greatest movies of all time that dealt with the panda, and with new media coverage of it. It starred Will Ferrell. What am I talking about? 1970s. Well, it wasn't produced in the 1970s. And the answer is San Diego. Anchorman. Wow. Modern culture. All right. So Anchorman. What is the deal with Anchorman? What's the big news story that they go for then? Birth of a baby panda, right? So that was a captive breeding program. That was a legitimate story and everything like that. They had, you know, pandas have been in trouble for a while, and they were trying to increase their numbers by bringing them inside and protecting them, and therefore also protecting their young. Problem was that wasn't really the problem with them. The problem was, of course, habitat destruction. But a lot of things do not breed well in captivity or won't breed at all. And that was the case with the pandas. They tried everything. They showed them videos of other pandas in the wild mating, i.e. panda porn, and it took literally decades to actually for them to do the deed and produce a viable offspring and for them to grow up and things like that. So it took a long time. So think about that as far as effectiveness. All that time that they're doing that or trying to get this done, these pandas could be out there in their natural environment reproducing, having their cubs and things like that, even though, you know, the problem was that a lot of times the cubs they didn't have enough nutrition, the moms, and the cubs were coming out not viable and stuff like that. So they thought that this would be a way to help them. It's not proven to be very effective in a lot of different scenarios. Okay, so that was the pandas, and then you have captive rearing, which is better. This is with egg-bearing organisms, you know, birds and of reptiles primarily. And this is where you hatch them, or you collect the eggs and then hatch them. One other thing what happens when you collect the eggs, it actually makes the bird or the reptile, birds more so, have more eggs. They'll reproduce and they'll actually lay more eggs, so you can actually increase the natural output. But then you rear them, you hatch them and everything, incubate them, hatch them in safety, and then in the case, for example, turtles, it's been pretty effective with, you go out there and you dump them out in the ocean where they're less likely that run that they have that you all are familiar with from down the beach when they're first hatched and they get eaten by all that kind of stuff. It protects them from that. And therefore that's a way to help populations, much more effective than captive breeding. And then finally, outbreeding, which we discussed earlier, which is where you have a genetically extinct population, a very small population. You bring in another, typically to make it true outbreeding, it would be another subspecies that's close enough genetically to breed with them, but it's not exactly the same organism, like with the Florida panthers. And with the Texas cougar, Florida panther, whatever you want to call it now, that will help to bring up their population that way. Any questions? All righty, that's it for today.